So welcome to all of you. How's it going today? Are you guys happy to be here for Pride?
Happy Pride. Very happy to be here.
Pride.
Yes, I hope so. All right, so as we jump in on this conversation with y'all, I just want to start off by asking, as people, I want to go around and ask the group. Obviously, I shared your titles and your names, but let's talk a little bit about where you're located and maybe something about you that really connects to the LGBTQ community or Pride as a whole. So Brian, would you like to get started?
Sure. So I'm actually in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I'm at our Sunrise campus. I live here with my husband. I think what's interesting about me and Pride, I lead actually the Pride Sunrise chapter, is that actually a bit of discrimination brought me to American Express. So I'm happy to be here and being my true authentic self.
Wow, thank you for sharing that, Brian. I'm sorry you went through that, but thank you. I'm so glad that you found a place that's much better for you. Jess, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'm Jess Lang. I live in Brooklyn, New York, with my partner and 2 kids. They are 8 and 5. And I say what connects me to the Pride community is really my commitment to representation and making sure that people can sort of see pathways for themselves, see themselves reflected in the people around them. I'm very committed to being a champion for the onlys in the room, because so much of my career I have been the only, whether it's the only woman of color, the only queer person, sometimes the only working parent. So that's what connects me.
That's amazing. And you're right. It's especially with people with multiple intersectionalities, it is really easy to be the only in a lot of different ways, not always all at once, but when those things converge, it's very isolating. So thank you for sharing that with us, Jess. RJ, what about you?
Hi, everyone. RJ, I'm sitting on the Upper West Side in New York City. Not quite as nice as where Brian is, but still we're starting to get warm. I guess what connects me, I've actually been with American Express for 20 years, not 10, but what I will say is I went through my coming out experience while I was at the company. And so, you know, in many ways, like Brian said, I sort of feel a connection to the place I work because it was a big part of my life, right? And a big part of who I am. And then the other thing I'll say is I just joined a board called Live Out Loud, which is an organization that's really focused on mentorship and sponsorship for LGBTQIA youth. And it's been awesome to sort of see that journey of, you know, from coming out at work in a company to then really thinking about that next generation and what they need to be able to bring their whole selves to work. So that's my connection.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing. So one thing I kind of wanted to address with this panel is that I think we all know people have people in our lives that maybe sit on opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to, progress and acceptance and understanding that LGBTQ people are an amazing and vibrant part of this world and something to be celebrated. And so for members of the community, it can sometimes very often seem that change doesn't really occur fast enough. And for others that either don't identify as part of the community or maybe don't have any real connection to the community, it can also seem like the world is transforming too rapidly. I know I can think of several people that I know that fit in both camps, unfortunately. So how does Amex work to ensure that both sides are really being listened to and respected when it comes to this divide? RJ, would you like to address this?
Yeah, sure. It's been interesting, right? Because I've been at the company for 20 years, as I mentioned, so I've seen the evolution of sort of how specifically not only our Pride network, but our colleague networks in general have grown and developed over the years, right? And I think what that comes down to is really education and dialogue. And so the way that I think the company has really advanced inclusion and diversity over the years through these networks, and now through a very senior level commitment, having an executive sponsor that sits in our executive committee for each of our colleague networks, means that we get a representation across the board of, unique, individual, diverse perspectives, backgrounds. And that results in a lot of education and dialogue, I think. You know, we now have 15 networks. We have 100 chapters globally. So, you know, I think that's really progressed how individuals can bring their point of view to everything that they're doing at work, whatever that is, and their background. But I've also seen that it means that very senior levels are listening to various people joining our organization, and in an opposite way, I've had some very new folks joining the workforce or joining the organization feel much more confident in coming to senior leadership and sharing their point of view on how the organization needs to progress. So I think it all comes down to having that open dialogue and feeling like you're at a place where you can contribute and have that discussion.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. And you're right, that top-down support is honestly really, really important in creating those safe spaces. You know, there's so many people out there who just don't feel safe. They don't feel secure. They don't feel supported in bringing that portion of themselves to work. And I mean, I can experience, I've experienced this from a very, very small way from, you know, the outside of the community. But, you know, it's, if you're not bringing your entire self to work, or the parts that are most important about you, or the parts that you love about yourself, it can make for a really uncomfortable work day. And we all spend too much time at work to be miserable there, right?
Well, and also you don't perform as well, right? If you're uncomfortable and miserable, what we always say to individuals is you are not bringing your best assets to American Express. Like you're just not. You're you know, people aren't getting the best out of you. Think about any environment where you've been uncomfortable or not feeling like you're supported. You know, you're gonna not bring your best, your A game, and so I totally agree with that.
Before we move on, can you expand a little bit about the colleague networks as well as the chapters of those and how that works within Amex?
Definitely. So we have a really a diverse colleague network base, and so one example is you know, obviously our Pride network, which consists of the LGBTQ plus community, but also allies. We have BEN, our Black Employee Network, and so various groups that that are really form around a community, and it's in a workplace, but it doesn't matter what business unit you're in, what level you're in. You're free to join that colleague network, and we do a lot. We do focus on community. We focus on colleagues. You know, mentorship, sponsorship. We focus on you know, just topics that might be applicable to that specific community. And more than anything, we focus on getting to know each other and rallying around shared experiences where we can exchange best practices. You know, we can help each other out. And it's really been a way to feel that sense of belonging across the organization in a group where maybe you don't necessarily feel it 100% in your individual team, because not everybody is having some similar experiences or backgrounds. And leadership, like I said, I mentioned before, our leadership team has done a lot to advance these over the years. And you know, each of these networks has a member of our executive committee who's our global sponsor, and they help us to advance things from a funding perspective, from a prioritization perspective. And they also make sure, quite frankly, that we have a voice in the room with the C-suite. So it's been a really effective way that we've advanced inclusion and diversity in the company.
That's so awesome to hear. Now, just as a personal aside, is when it comes to each chapter, you know, as they exist and as they function on their own, is there any kind of like a structure used so that if there's like a success in one area with a certain program there, it kind of gets spread to the rest of the org? Or is it more like, to, you know, kind of make a really awkward comparison, is it more like the Girl Scouts where each troop kind of, you know, does the work on their own and there's not a ton of communication between each group on like, hey, here's what we did, or here's what's working for us?
No, there's definitely a lot of best practice sharing. In fact, some people are members of several of the colleague networks, depending on, where your interests lie or who you identify with. And what I would say is we have a section of our colleague experience group who specifically focuses on bringing best practices from each of those teams together, and also helps us just from a central governance perspective as well, so that we have the resources and tools that we need to continue to grow the chapters, to bring others along. We just launched a virtual Pride, a truly virtual Pride section of the Pride Plus network for non-hub cities, and they were critical in helping us, set up the infrastructure around that.
That's so
And
great.
I think too, on top of that, Meg, is that they all support each other, right? So as we kind of focused on things that were going on in the Black employee network, the Pride networks actually showed allyship and supported those causes, and I think that's a good way across all of our networks that happens.
Totally, I absolutely love that. Thank you for sharing that, Brian. Okay, so before we jump into our next question, I just want to highlight, I know that y'all had developed a Pride Guide presentation. Did y'all want to share that now, or would you prefer to do that later in the chat?
I think we'll share it later if that's okay.
That's totally fine.
Any
I
of us
wanted to
has
make sure we held time for it, because it sounds like a really great presentation, and I want to make sure we get to share that with our audience. So Jess, we're actually going to move to you next. Can you talk to us about some of the recent initiatives that Amex has brought up regarding the LGBTQIA+ space? I'm particularly interested in the resources that Amex offers non-members of the community who might be looking to learn more and educate themselves around, terminology, pronouns, social mores. Don't ask about this. That's not your business. Here's where you can help. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
I'm really interested to see what the company's been doing.
So I will answer that, and we've done a lot of great things. What I would just say to some of the points that RJ made around the culture at Amex, I've been at the company less than 2 years. I've worked at a number of places before Amex, and what I can say is the sort of curiosity by the broader community is really something I think special and differentiating about the culture here. I was just on a Pride panel earlier this week or last week, talking about my own sort of journey as a parent, and thinking through and supporting my kids through their gender exploration. And the number of parents who are not part of the LGBTQ community who reached out and wanted to learn more and wanted to share their own stories is just something really unique about the broader sort of culture of belonging at Amex. But the sort of 2 points that I would raise that we recently rolled out, one is self-ID. And we talk a lot about representation, and the importance of representation is advocacy. And how can the company advocate on behalf of the community? And one of the biggest levers we have to do that is through data, through people self-identifying confidentially, to make sure that we are really informed, right? So that we understand who our colleagues are, what's important to them. In order to drive an inclusive culture, we kind of have to know who we're including. So that self-identification has rolled out in 4 major markets, the UK, US, India, and Mexico. And we're really proud of that. And it's been, we've seen a lot of momentum in the adoption of that. The second is inclusive signatures. We talk a lot about how people define themselves and how people want to be communicated with. We know that language matters. We also know that vocabulary sort of changes at the speed of light, right? And so how do we give people the platform to specify how they'd like to be identified, how they do identify, and it's broader than the LGBTQI community. It's a cultural way of increasing belonging as well, right? And we're very much about not making assumptions about who someone is or how to engage them. And so while sort of pronoun signatures were maybe born out of a specific need, we really do see broader applicability of it.
That's so wonderful. The idea of that self-identification, you're right. I mean, it sounds it sounds almost too simple to need to be said, but you're right. It's very hard to to provide or cater to a group if you don't know that those people are there or know what they need. And I think, kind of harkening back to what RJ was talking about with like that, making that safe space and having that top-down support at Amex, if you don't have that, people are going to very probably rightly, be a bit hesitant or question or worried about asking them to self-identify. And I think it's really important that, that you go to the lengths of keeping the data confidential, leaving it up to the individual if they would like to self-identify or not. I've seen in other communities I've been a part of, once one person or a couple of people start stepping up and saying, hey, this is a problem that I'm dealing with, or this is what I need to be supported in, or this is who I am, people that feel comfortable doing that and being the first they're so necessary. There has to be one person to start it. Otherwise, everyone feels like they're the only one. And without that community, that's a very isolated place to be. So I think that's absolutely wonderful. Thank you for detailing that out. I especially like the idea about, taking a guide for things like terminology. I mean, sadly enough, words like BIPOC were not part of my vocabulary prior to last summer, mostly because, it just wasn't clear what terminology we should be using. And even more importantly, we weren't having the conversations we needed to have around specific communities that need support and really need, have unmet needs and unheard needs. So yeah, I think that's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, and we try to meet people where they are, right? When we roll out something like inclusive signatures, we also release a guide to pronouns to just help people, really make those sort of transitions on their own and in their own way, but to give them the language, and it's sort of a toolkit to help, because not everyone's in the same place.
No, you're completely right. And, it's one of those things where you might be ignorant of what's going on, but that doesn't mean you can't learn. It doesn't mean that you can't educate yourself and look out and making those resources even easier and even more accessible to people. You're right. It's much more helpful in trying to reach people where they are, especially if those people are not really with it. They're not really in support, or they don't understand, or they're, it's things like that can really help, kind of bring people into the fold, or educate them and wake them up to ways that they can help. I absolutely love that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of these unique initiatives that y'all have developed around the DEI space. I really am interested if there's anyone in particular, or a couple or whatever, that have really made you proud or inspired you in your work and in this larger development and larger conversation that you're having at the company. Brian, would you like to go first?
Sure. And one of the things that I like is that what I think is different about the way American Express is approaching it is diversity and inclusion are being treated as two actions. Right. It's often that a company is working on diversity and inclusion, right? But American Express, we've been very clear about, with diversity, we want a lot of different faces around. And with inclusion, we want everyone to have a seat at the table, right? And be a part of the conversation and a part of steering going forward. And I think having that focus that way really does make sure you hit both angles of it, right? And I also think too, when you look at just our leadership response, right? I would say 2020, 2019 with COVID, it has been the ultimate leadership gauntlet of how to deal with things that are going on in the work environment. And the leadership at American Express very clearly said, we're not going to be first back in the office. We're not tracking that. That's not how we're responding, but we are going to lead diversity and inclusion from the front, right? We want that to be our hallmark, and that's what we want to be different about being a colleague at American Express, being a customer of American Express.
That's wonderful, and I can't kind of agree with you strongly enough. One of the things that we talked about early in the pandemic, but I think a lot of people have also come to recognize, is that everyone working from home doesn't make you less professional. It just makes you a lot more real and really brings into focus who you really are, where you're living, what your situation is like. And like we were talking about earlier, without not having that ability to bring your whole self to work, moving into the virtual workspace and remote and working from home makes it even more difficult for, you know,
Right.
there to be that layer in between. And so that's one of the things that I've loved, really. I mean, I've been working remote for 2.5 years, but I really love that ability to bring people into my house and really see how they live and what their situation is like. I mean, I know it's a pretty hackneyed trope at this point, but you know, we're all going through this storm, but we're not all in the same boat. And so I absolutely love the idea of really looking at diversity and equity as two different things and taking advantage of the current situation to really get that up close idea of, you know, how things are going. How are you doing really? What's happening outside of work, as well as in addition to. So I love that. Jess or RJ, are there any other initiatives that y'all have seen? It doesn't have to be at Amex, obviously, but any initiatives in the DEI space that maybe inspired stuff that you're doing at Amex, or even just inspired you to keep moving forward?
Honestly, I've been most inspired by some of the organic initiatives that have happened across teams and people that I work with. We just launched, our wider team just launched an hour every month or every other month called Come As You Are. And it's a session where we literally just get together as a group. We don't have a preset agenda, and we talk about various topics. The most recent topic that we definitely talked about Black Lives Matter. We talked about parents and caregivers the last time, and a lot of people shared their stories about, you know, how that's impacting work, you know, what's on their mind, and it got really raw, and it ended up being quite a good trust session, is how I would describe it. And we got such good feedback from people who were like, we should do more of this. And it was so organic. It wasn't like a big presentation. We didn't have guest speakers. And sometimes those are the most impactful things, I think, that people are doing across teams.
No, you're right. Oh, go ahead, Jess. I'm so sorry.
Well, that's okay. What I would add to what RJ said is that, you know, we have these ERGs and these groups, but there's a lot of collaboration across them too. You know, Meg, you spoke about intersectionality. That is a huge topic at American Express, right? How do you really think about and navigate all of the layers to who you are? And so whether it's, you know, I am a member of Pride, I'm a member of the Women's Interest Network, and I'm a member of the Asian American and Pacific Islander community group as well. And they come together to jointly program, to really think about people as a whole. And so we've been really inspired as we've gone through this year that's been really difficult for a lot of people to find that connection, and really tried to make it so that people don't have to choose what hat they're wearing, right? And can really find that community across the different groups here.
I love that idea of like not having to pick between your various affinity groups or the labels that you feel best apply to you, or the needs that you have that would be met within different communities. You know, I was kind of thinking to myself, since you said you're a working parent, the idea that if you didn't feel really supported in, you know, in the sense of being from the LGBTQ community, it would be really hard to get support as a working parent, given that you are not doing this in the traditional way, or in the way that most people assume is the traditional way, I should say. So yeah, it's one of those things that I think that you're right. You have to consider people's intersectionalities and understand that, you know, this is where they are, these are the things that they need, but it gets more complex the more intersectionalities you add. It doesn't make it like less valuable or less important. And it's, you know, it's kind of the same as working from home, right? Doing remote work is not really any more difficult than doing work in an office. It's just a little bit different prep work on the front end to make sure that the result is up to everyone's standards. And I think that's the same thing with intersectionality. You have to leave room to consider things that you don't know, that you might not know about other people, and give them the space, if they would like and if they feel safe, to share with you what they need, who they are, and how you can really help bring their best selves to work. Brian,
Yeah, and
you'd like, oh, I'm sorry, Jess, I keep interrupting you. My bad.
No, that's okay. I keep butting in. I'll just say one more thing on that, because I think it's really important, and it's something that American Express thinks a lot about, which is that idea of whole self, right? And I've spent much more time of my outside of Amex than I have inside. And what I can say, and I've loved almost every place I've worked, I've always felt like it was sort of in spite of, right? I got this promotion despite the fact that like I'm a woman of color and like I feel sort of like the only one in the room. At Amex, it very much is a because of, not in spite of. And I would say that the emphasis on whole self, we spend a lot of time just getting to know each other. RJ just mentioned like you have a lot of casual time just understanding where someone comes from, what their life looks like, and it adds to the professional story. It adds to the professional relationship. There isn't that dichotomy of who you are at home and who you are at work, and that feels really different.
Yeah, I agree. It's the idea that you can, in all of the past ideas of, well, it's either or, it's black or white. You get this or that, not both. Why? Why not? Why not pick some from column A and some from column B? It's not that hard a thing to make. As soon as you make that paradigm shift for yourself and you stop thinking of it as a binary, so many more possibilities open up. Possibilities not just for personal growth, but for professional growth. It's really, it's key to, really bringing, great services to your clients, or, expanding your customer base and really like providing them the things they need. I think it's so great. And you're right, it has very far reaching implications. Brian, did you want to touch on this?
Yeah, there was one more I was thinking through, because we've actually just kind of like formed our executive pride group, and there's been a lot of action there. And I think the importance of having out leadership is really critical, right? And I can remember, so I'm not a new leader, and I've obviously worked somewhere else before American Express, right? But when I actually sat in a room and listened to my CIO, Brian Saluzzo, talk about his husband and the choices he made about being an out leader coming to a new place of employment, it kind of clicks for you, right? I can see someone like me in a leadership role. And that just it was like a light bulb on moment for me of what it feels like for other folks, or the onlys, that aren't seeing representation in leadership. So the importance of being an out leader, I think, is really key. And that's been something that's been evolving too really nicely at American Express.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. That visibility and that setting that example, really, it's important. I mean, the idea we've talked over our past several summits about things like the glass ceiling or the bamboo ceiling, and I think it's also a question, or a matter of that rainbow ceiling, right? You might have like the diversity within your company, but if that doesn't exist at the leadership level, if it kind of hits a certain plateau, it can be really hard to see where you might fit in at that table. Or, never mind the fact that not everybody's built to be a pioneer, right? Not everyone feels safe to do that. Not everyone even really wants to be in that space. So the idea of coming to a place where not only are they open and clear and upfront about being supportive and being a safe place for you to bring your whole self to work, but knowing that you're not going to have to be the groundbreaker. It takes a huge weight off you. It's lovely. All right, so to shift our conversation a little bit, we're going to talk a little bit about mentorship. But before we do that, I just want to highlight for our audience again, if y'all have questions that you would like to pose to the Amex team, you want to have them expand on something we've talked about already, please feel free to do so. If you throw your questions or comments into the group thread, it'll see on the right-hand side of your screen. I will be happy to raise them to the Amex team. So please feel free to participate there. All right, so RJ, let's talk a little bit about mentorship, because things like mentorship and sponsorship can really help, kind of drive and propel a career to create opportunities for people, especially within underrepresented groups like the LGBTQIA+ community. Can you talk a little bit about what you see as the difference between mentorship and sponsorship? Because obviously they're two different things, but I'd like to clarify that for our audience.
Yeah, absolutely. We have quite a few. So for me, mentorship is something that can be organized and facilitated. And we have a lot of mentorship programs within the company, one of them within Pride. And it's a great opportunity to get to know various leaders, various colleagues across those networks or across any network really through mentorship programs. But I describe it as that's the opportunity to get to know somebody, to get their advice, to make sure that they're sharing their experience with you, and you're really getting to know them. And it's a great safe space in an ideal mentorship setup where you can bounce ideas off of that person. You can feel a safe environment, to your point earlier, where you can, you really can seek their advice, and you can go over, potential challenges you're having in the workplace, potential challenges at home. And so oftentimes we focus on mentorship programs where we're pairing people up who may benefit from getting to know each other, or who the specific person says, I'd like a mentor who's done this before, who has gone through this before, is in this specific business unit, or is a working parent. A sponsorship for me is very different. For me, sponsorship is something that you earn by working with somebody else, or being in an environment where that person sees your work in action, and is also someone who sort of takes a little bit of responsibility for what I call pulling you up. And that is where we have a responsibility as leaders, I think, to really make sure that we are looking to be sponsors, because we, I think all of us can look back on times when we either wish we'd had a sponsor who was looking out for us, or where we really depended on a sponsor and it made a big difference. Somebody that was that only, gay person in the room, gay leader in the room, that you thought, gosh, that person, even just spending a few extra minutes with me or talking about his or her experience, gave me permission. It gave me a safe space. Or that person who sort of looked around and said, that person actually is the quietest person in the room and is not on any specific project where we're able to hear from them. We're able to hear their point of view. And so I'm gonna look out for that person. I'm gonna pull them up. And so we talk a lot as Exec Pride about sort of what our responsibility is associated with that, right? Because I think a lot of people need those sponsors. Now, mentors can become sponsors, certainly. But I see the mentor relationship as sort of a kickoff to eventually, hopefully, becoming a sponsor. I think both are important to, particularly in an organization like American Express. We are a heavy relationship-based culture, and so we place a lot of value on that. And so we do a lot of coffee. People call us a coffee chat culture. Mentor programs are a great way to be able to kick that off. And then once you get a sponsor, you stay in close contact with that person, right? Even when you move around or you move companies or you leave the organization, a sponsor will stay with you, and is somebody that you can include as. I once had a leader who had what was called a PAB, a personal advisory board, which I think is amazing, right? We all need one of those in life, and sponsors can be that, right? They can be somebody who's sort of looking out for you and you really can depend on.
Yeah, it's funny to hear you say that, because we've had past speakers. There's been a lot, because I host these chat and learns about 3 to 5 times a week. But there have been many people that we've spoken to in the past that have talked about having that personal board of directors. Having the people that are on your team. For me, it's several of my closest girlfriends and a couple professional people that I have met throughout my career that I feel like they have their stuff together, and so it's having that space to kind of not necessarily bounce ideas off of, but like check in. Hey, here's what I'm planning on doing. Does this seem out of character for me? Does this seem like something that's going to help me or hurt me? And I absolutely love that. And you're right, it's that relationship. All these relationships can get pretty blended, right? You can have, like we talked about earlier, you can kind of wear multiple hats for even for multiple people within your org or within your own network. And I like what you called out about, sponsorship really following you, even if you do leave the company or your sponsor does. Because I think in the past, I've been guilty of this. I assumed that kind of the difference between sponsorship and mentorship was that mentors don't necessarily need to be at your org, which I feel like is still true, because sometimes it can help to have that distance or that change in perspective. But I absolutely love the idea that there doesn't have to be that division. It can be, you know, a mentor can be somebody who is at your org, and so can a sponsor. So I absolutely love that. So
Yep.
Jess or Brian, would you like to speak on this before we keep going?
The only thing I would add is how important peer mentorship is. I think we talk a lot or think a lot about mentorship as someone who needs to be more senior to you or in a different place in their career. And I always think about it as if I'm freaking out and I need to text someone who's on the other side of that bat phone, when you're just having either a crisis of confidence or you need to bounce ideas around, or you're in a negotiation and you need really transparent advice. Building and nurturing that peer network as a mentor network is an important element as well.
Yes, absolutely. Brian, how about you?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, you know, we kind of focus on the moment of crisis when you need it. But if you actually make that part of your process of checking in with others, hey, I had an idea, what do you think about this idea, et cetera, you grow that naturally, right? And it's a great way to collaborate and build that network and keep building it so that you're standing on top of a network of success.
No, I
It's funny that it's funny that you called that out, Jess, because I actually, my very first leader in the company is now retired, but I went on to become more senior than her while she was at the company. Didn't matter. Like, I would still call her. She was my mentor and sponsor, like, no matter what. So it has nothing to do with levels. It has to do with the relationship and what you're both giving to each other and the connection, right? So I fully agree. It can be at the peer level for sure.
Thank you for sharing that, RJ. It actually kind of brings me into something else I wanted to ask all of you. Can you share with us how any of you, if any, have participated in a mentorship program, either as a mentor or as a mentee? I'm really keen to hear maybe what you got from the process, or maybe something that you learned throughout the process that was, you know, contrary to what you thought or was surprising along the way. Jess, would you like to start?
Sure. I participate from both ends. I am a mentor through a couple of different programs at American Express. And I also have mentors who are outside of the company, because sometimes you need that neutral point of view to help you think about things. And what I found are a couple of things. One, chemistry really matters. And I think there are a lot of programs that match mentors and mentees. And I think it's okay to go in with best intentions. And sometimes it's a great match and sometimes it's not, but it's a big commitment. And so if you're going to commit to being on either side of that, make sure that you jive and that, you know, the conversation and the guidance seems to be working. And I would also say, I learn as much from mentoring as I do from being a mentee myself. And I think, you know, some of the challenges people are thinking through, some of the areas that they want to explore are just as useful and beneficial to me as I hope they are to them. And so it really is a value exchange that goes both ways.
I absolutely love that. And you're totally right. It is a very, you know, it can be a very formal arrangement, but it can also be very informal. And I think that it's important to recognize that no matter where it falls on that spectrum, it's an important undertaking, right? There is a certain amount of not just time, but, you know, concentration and knowledge that is required to enter into that arrangement as a mentor, and honestly, even as a mentee, because you kind of need to know at least a little bit where you're going, where you want to go vaguely, or a mentor is not really going to be able to help you find your path if all you can give them is, well, here I am. Okay, so are we trying to go that way or in the general that direction, or like where are you trying to go? And so it's really hard when, you know, you might not know, but that's sort of where, like you said, the selection kind of thing comes into play, right? Is looking for people whose careers you admire, or looking for people who, you know, have that really great teaching ability around them. That's so awesome. Let's see, Brian, would you like to touch on this?
Sure, and I totally agree. I want to agree with what Jess said, that there's often that relationship, that personality match in a mentor-mentee relationship. And don't be afraid to call it, right? If it's not working, it's okay. It's not working. You can move on to something else. I also agree. I think learning, it's a two-way street, because I actually go into every relationship that way, thinking, what am I going to learn from this individual, right? And I often do. And then I also set up special types, like different generational, like, okay, I'm obviously not a millennial, and I want to do some reverse mentoring with the millennial to understand their perspective that they're having, what their day in my work life is like, and how do we make it easier, and how do we do different things. So I think all of those angles are very valid. There is a commitment to it, but I think you get, like, I talk to the majority of folks that I've mentored in my career, I still talk to them. And I think it's helped, and some of them have been advanced further, and they're helping me now too, right? So it all works out good.
Well, I can tell you from the perspective of an elder millennial, it's not all it's cracked up to be, so don't worry about it. But I absolutely love the idea of kind of doing that reverse mentorship of, seeing what the, the young pups are up to, the spring chickens in the world. And forgive me for making the comparison, because this is high praise as far as I'm concerned, but kind of getting to be that wise old man at the top of the mountain that everybody consults about things, and seeing or perceiving that you might have more experience or a different perspective. That's valuable, but I love that you highlight that it's just as important to, kind of see where these other people are coming from, whether they're separated from you by, generation, or they're separated from you by a different industry or whatever. I think that's wonderful. And I love that you maintain those connections. RJ, would you like to tell us a little bit about your experience more, or are you good after having shared earlier with us?
I'll just share one. I actually, off the back of that, I actually just recently, I've seen some leaders do this, and I saw it really successfully done. I just got a reverse mentor, and similarly, I think this person I'm going to end up working for one day, hands down. So I might as well start learning from him now. But it's been really great. We just started, but it's been really great to just get a sense of what's on that person's mind, and maybe what a different generation or a different level of the organization is thinking, because that's just, I think, Jess's point earlier, and what Brian said, it's just as informative, right? And you learn, just as much. And the other thing I would just add is, I've learned that it's okay to have some time-bound mentorships. So there does come a point where you're probably going to stay in touch from a relationship perspective, but you don't need to be meeting every month. Like, it's okay to let that monthly slot go. It doesn't mean your mentorship is ending, right? Because it just is just transforming into something different, given the evolution of the relationship. So I've also learned that that's okay, as we sort of come back together and talk about what's next, especially if you're talking to somebody about a new role, or they're trying to move into an organization. You might have some time-bound objectives that you're trying to help each other with.
Yes, I think it's so important to highlight that these relationships, just like basically everything besides death and taxes, these things change. It's okay. That's what they're supposed to. And I love the idea of recognizing that once you forge this relationship, hopefully it's a relationship that's beneficial to both parties. And like Brian was talking about, able to continue on regardless of, what shifts or changes happen in your personal or professional lives. But I think it's also important to note that, they don't have to. And if it's something that, there comes a time where it's less important to be in constant contact or in frequent contact with someone, it doesn't mean that's how it's got to be forever. So I love that. Thank you, RJ, for that. We're seeing some really great comments in the chat thread over here. Tracy Ray is saying, I love the different perspectives, and this is of huge value. Allies can learn from this too. And I want to use that to kind of segue into our next question. We had wanted to ask you a little bit about allyship. So as someone outside of the community, but who very much wants to support and be there to help in any way I can, what role does that allyship play when you are trying to build this strong value-based culture at an organization, especially one as large as Amex? Brian, would you like to start us off on this?
Yeah, and I thought I would just start with a definition of allyship, right? That's that lifelong process of building a meaningful relationship based on trust and accountability with marginalized individuals and or groups of people, right? And a funny story, a little bit of a background. So I come from a pretty large family, right, with a strong female lead, and I've got all sisters. And I would say I'm always, supportive of women's rights, right? But one of my CIOs at a previous place called me out on that, and he said, how do you demonstrate that support? Do you go to women in technology meetings? Do you go to be their ally and to stand there with them, advancing their cause? Or are you just sitting in the stand saying, being a cheerleader, right? And I think as we kind of focus on allyship and the new future, it's about helping each other to the next level and reaching in and being a part of that struggle, understanding that struggle, and seeing how can you help advance their cause.
So sorry, didn't realize I hadn't unmuted myself. Thank you, Brian, for highlighting that, because I think you're right. You're touching on something that's really important, which is, I know everybody says like ally is a verb, and it is, but it's very important to think of it, like if you say that you brush your teeth, you have to keep doing that. It's not something you do once and then you're good. So, if you look at allyship in the same way, if you're not doing something daily to push this forward, not only are you not advancing the course of progress, but you might be actively hindering it in ways that you may or may not know. And so if you make it more of that habit, it becomes something that not only is a part of your identity, but is also part of the larger impact that you're having on the people around you, and maybe even on people that you will never meet, that you don't know about. And it's so important to think of that. So thank you for sharing that. You're right. People are very, very quick to call out or label themselves in certain ways based on their relationship to other people or their proximity to other people. And I think you're right. It's very important to know that if you want that title, I feel like that's not the right word for it, but if you want to claim that, you need to kind of walk that walk and make it something that you do consistently. So thank you for sharing that. Jess or RJ, do you have anything else you'd like to touch on? Let's start with Jess, actually.
Yeah, I would say we've had a lot of conversations at Amex and beyond around privilege and how to, as an ally, understand and sort of mark your own privilege and use it on behalf of the community you're trying to support, and to be really reflective of that. I talk a lot about my own intersectionality, but I also have cis privilege that I need to use on behalf of the non-binary and trans community. And just to really be thoughtful about, when you're saying you're an ally, what do you have on the line? What are you putting out there on behalf of that community? Because you're right, it's easy to just say, hey, I'm in it with you. But really putting some skin in the game and understanding how to use your privilege on behalf of the group you want to advocate for.
Thank you so much for saying that. I identify very heavily with what you're talking about. I am a cisgender, heterosexual, white, middle-class female. That gives me a very large amount of privilege. I come from a resource background. I have food in my fridge, a roof over my head, my needs are met. This is not, I try not to take these things for granted, but it's very easy. It's very easy to get complacent in your bubble, and this is what your world is. And so while a lot of these things put me in a very privileged situation or put me in the majority for a lot of situations, I'm also neurodiverse. I have bipolar disorder. And so in addition to ADHD, and so there's a lot that goes on with me that I feel safe discussing that and labeling myself and talking about that with other people, but a lot of other people might not. And so I find it just as important to use the privilege that I do have in many spaces to elevate and push forward not only progress for underrepresented groups that I do identify with, but also underrepresented groups that have nothing to do with me, that need help, because we're trying to have a society here. Be a good person. That's, you got to care about the people around you. So I think that's absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for touching on that, Jess. RJ, is there anything you'd like to add before we keep going?
I think I would just say that I like what you said about it being a daily habit, because you also have to train yourself to look out for where your privilege or when your unconscious bias is maybe accidentally there and not being, not using your privilege effectively. And I'll give you an example. A couple of weeks ago, I have a colleague who is a cisgendered straight white male, leads a big team within the company, and called me and said, I think I am missing the mark on people that I might have LGBTQ plus people on my team that I'm inadvertently talking about football when we got on the phone or doing things that, and he recognized it and said, I really would love to like your perspective on tips of ways that I can just create a little bit of a safer place for my team. Yeah, I never would have, I give him a lot of kudos for sort of thinking about that and thinking like, as an ally, I have a responsibility now to break my own habits, which feel natural and normal, but might not be in the best serving the rest of my team in the same way. And we all have that. We all have it. Doesn't matter who you are. So if you can recognize it and think about those marginalized folks on your team and look out for them or in the organization, I think you can do small things which start to change the way people feel. And then it will also give you a little bit of new thinking to think about more, big hitting things that you can be doing to use your privilege more effectively.
Yes, thank you for that. I think you're right. That's a very good call out that you don't know what you don't know, but everybody, if you come to life in general with a sense of curiosity, it will lead you much more effectively towards success and towards collaboration and towards great things than assuming that you know everything or that the way you're currently doing things is how it's going to be and you don't need to change anything. You know that you're an ally. We're getting comments in the chat thread, especially from Neil, saying, I love Brian's view on being proactive, getting off the sidelines, kind of like RJ is talking about, as the progression and ultimate realization of really what it means to be an ally. So before we move into our last question here, we only have about 4 minutes left. I just want to talk a little bit on what RJ had talked about that coworker that had come to you with questions, because I know that especially coming from the ally community, as it were, it can feel really difficult to maybe not necessarily trust outside sources, but if you do know someone or someone in your orbit is part of the Alphabet Mafia, it can be very easy to ask them questions that you have real honest, earnest curiosity about, but also don't want to put them in that position of being the representative of their entire group. So let's talk a little bit about how allies interact with that Pride colleague network and how that interaction is helping benefit the rest of the org.
I can start real quick with that. A great example of that is the executive sponsor for Pride Sunrise prior to me was my peer Harvey, who is an ally, right? And he felt so committed to the cause that he stood up to be the executive sponsor for the Pride Network.
That's wonderful. Anybody else want to add? You don't have to if you don't want to. It's totally cool.
Oh, just similarly, I am the sort of exec co-chair of the New York Pride group, and I run that with an ally who gives a lot of her time to helping advocate for a community that she's just there to support.
That is absolutely wonderful. RJ?
Yeah, and I would just add, I keep going back to that, our CEO has asked his executive team, to, champion one of our ERGs each, and it's all, a lot of times it's an ally, right? And so they get really passionate about what they can do to support, and it sets a tone, right? It sets a tone of people stepping up. And I go back to this, we have a responsibility, right? You have a responsibility, especially as a leader in a company. And so the more you can, think about how to become an ally across the board, the better.
Completely. All right. So for our last question, I usually like to ask this in more of a long form way, so apologies, but I want to make sure we address it. I want from each of you, as quick as we can, unfortunately, if you could go back in time and give yourself one piece of advice, what would you tell that person? Brian, would you like to start?
Sure, I do too, because I'm an overachiever that way. So one, I would just tell myself it gets better, right? And then second is to be true to yourself and hold on to that.
Brian, you're going to make me break my rule of not crying during interviews. Thank you for sharing that. Jess, would you like to go next?
Sure, I would tell myself to be less afraid.
Strong advice. Difficult, but strong. I love it. RJ, how about you?
Yeah.
I think perspective. It's very difficult to have perspective when you're not seeing the sort of long life, hopefully, that you will live. And so everything's learning. Even what you go through from a hardship perspective or a growth moment, it all makes up who you are. So perspective is what I would tell myself. Look for it, be patient with it.
I absolutely love that. It reminds me of a cheesy music lyric from a kids movie I loved as a child. It talks about how your life is a thread in a tapestry. And if you're only focused on that one thread, you can't see the larger picture. You can't see the pattern. You can't see what you might be a part of and what you might be building. So I love that idea of perspective. Thank you. One thing I want to highlight before we go is that we are hosting a virtual job fair tomorrow, and Amex is partnering with us and is going to be there. So if the things that you've heard today are inspiring you to learn even more about Amex or look to see where you might fit within the Amex family, please come to that virtual event. I'll be there, so you'll be see at least one friendly face. And it's a really great opportunity to get some face time with the Amex team and learn more about their amazing company culture. So I want to say a huge thank you to Jess, Brian, and RJ. This has been an absolute pleasure. I'm so happy to have spent the afternoon with you. Thank you so much for being here and sharing with us and being so open. It's truly an honor.